The illusion of invulnerability was the beginning of our downfall. For ages, the idea of defeat seemed mythical, something the Valtherians would never need to consider. Born for conflict, molded by the heat of battle, we placed blind trust in our power. But now looking back, the question echoes, did we choose to ignore the signs, or were we simply blind? He deserted starports, whispers of shattered families, unsettling silences from the borders. It was all there, yet we clung to the absurd conviction that war would never reach Varnax, our homeworld. So, I ask, how can a people so strong succumb without even seeing the danger? And when the truth was thrown in our faces, how did we react? The answer is as simple as it is painful. We denied it. We denied it until the very end. The conflict with humans was the longest and most devastating campaign our species had ever faced. Our legendary star fleets were reduced to rubble, and half of our colonies fell under the weight of the enemy. Yet Varnax, our home, seemed beyond destruction's reach. To us, war was always distant, fought in galaxies we would never see. Even as orbital ports emptied and losses in our ranks became unbearable, we refused to believe in the possibility of defeat. For us, to fight was existence, and victory the only acceptable outcome. It had always been so. But history, for those willing to listen, teaches one thing: even giants have their moments of collapse. So when the announcement came, a formal declaration of surrender, it paralyzed us. This couldn't be happening, not to the Valtherians, who grew stronger after every blow. Surrender was a concept that didn't exist in our language, yet there it was, unyielding and cold. War was no longer distant. It was here, and for the first time, we faced an enemy we didn't know how to defeat. At first, the idea seemed absurd, an error by a low-ranking official or sabotage of our communications by humans. But confirmation after confirmation came, crushing any hope that it was a mistake. The truth was inescapable. The Varnax Council had decided the war was lost. There were no other options but surrender. The hours that followed felt surreal, as if we were living in a nightmare no one could wake from. Daily life dissolved. Workplaces were abandoned, schools closed, and collective apathy consumed the streets. Desolate faces wandered aimlessly, unsure of how to process the impossible. The Valtherians had never surrendered. Not in millennia, not in dozens of intergalactic wars. The war against humans had seemed so promising at first. Our initial attack annihilated one of their largest fleets, and we captured several colonies. Before they could organize significant resistance, we had tactical, strategic, and technological superiority. Above all, we had an unshakable belief in our invincibility. The humans, however, were long-time adversaries. They had supplied weapons to the Krivani during our war against them, conspired to destabilize our colonies, and crept ever closer to our sphere of influence. They were seen as ruthless, voracious, destroying everything in their path. It was inconceivable that such a race could defeat us, and yet the impossible happened. When the truth finally took root, it brought something we had long forgotten: fear. Rumors spread like wildfire. Human occupation forces were on their way, and their atrocities were already legendary. Summary executions, forced labor, unspeakable tortures. These stories had returned from our devastated colonies. Long before the first human ship landed on Varnax, despair consumed many. Suicides became common among those who preferred death to the humiliation and brutality they believed was inevitable. The world we knew was gone. This is a story of pride, fear, and survival that resonates deeply. How would you react in such a decisive moment? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us, what would you do in the Valtherians' place? Your perspective could illuminate new paths in this narrative. For many, the choice seemed clear. Better to accept the inevitable with dignity than face cruelty in forced labor camps. Even so, our government was adamant. Suicide was forbidden, and they urged us to endure the unthinkable for the sake of future generations. Most obeyed, though some questioned why we should follow orders from those who had led us to ruin. Those dissenters found no tolerance. They were quickly detained, a stark reminder of how fragile our freedoms had become. Isolated protests emerged in some areas, led by soldiers and civilians still clamoring for resistance. But these actions were disorganized and short-lived. Anticipating the chaos surrender could bring, the government had stationed loyal troops in key locations. Any serious unrest was crushed before it could gain momentum. Most of us, however, were paralyzed by fear. There was no fight left, no escape. All we could do was wait. And so we did, sitting in silence, watching time pass as the future unraveled. Before us, like an inevitable sentence. A month after the initial announcement, the day finally came. The government said nothing, perhaps to avoid panic. But that night, a cold and brief transmission announced, "The human fleet will reach orbit tomorrow." There was no uproar, only overwhelming resignation. Many said their goodbyes to loved ones, retreating into their homes to reflect on their lives. Others raised telescopes to the sky, watching the enemy ships approach. The occupation fleet was colossal, not necessarily larger than our old armadas, but infinitely more numerous than anything we had left. And so, under that dark sky filled with unfamiliar lights, we waited, not as the proud warriors we once were, but as a people who knew their history was about to change forever. The human fleet was larger than anything we had ever imagined. It was more than double the strength of our greatest armada at the start of the war. Even more alarming, we knew this wasn't the full extent of their power. Other fleets patrolled our territories, garrisoned conquered worlds, and hunted the last remnants of our forces. Finally, we understood how we had lost, but this realization came too late to make a difference. The surrender ceremony took place aboard one of the human cruisers and was broadcast on every screen across Varnax. Many of us watched in horror, expecting our leaders to be humiliated before the enemy commanders, forced to admit defeat and exalt the supremacy of our conquerors. After all, that was how we had treated our own defeated foes. Elaborate speeches, public confessions, and often summary executions. But what we witnessed was disorienting. The leaders of Varnax were neither insulted nor punished. Instead, they were handed a simple document, written on material that seemed rudimentary. They were told only to sign. For a brief moment, the broadcast was interrupted as an official voice explained that this piece of paper represented the formal terms of surrender. By signing, our leaders, and by extension the entire Valtherian Empire, acknowledged its legitimacy. The simplicity of the act left us baffled. No speeches, no spectacle of public humiliation. When the broadcast resumed, our leaders made a concise declaration of surrender and apology. It felt almost like a postscript, as if the humans saw little importance in prolonging the moment, and then it was over. No executions, no torture. The strangeness of it all planted a spark of hope in some of us, but for the majority, only fear remained. Within hours, the first human ships landed. Troops spread through our cities, taking control with methodical precision. Like many others, I stood frozen with uncertainty. I watched the troops from my apartment window, debating whether to hide or confront them head-on. The world we knew no longer existed. Yet here we were, still breathing, waiting to see what would come next. I decided to step away from the window, thinking it might shield me from any random violence. But in the end, curiosity won. I peered out again, and what I saw is etched in my memory forever. First came the tanks, hovering mere inches above, the ground on suspension fields as they moved through the streets. We had similar technology, but these vehicles were monstrous, at least twice the weight and armor of anything we had ever built. Then came the troop transports, gliding with the same lethal efficiency, their hulls bristling with armed soldiers. But what came after left me utterly speechless. Infantry. Row upon row of soldiers equipped with exoskeletons so robust, they seemed like an extension of the tanks themselves. We also used exoskeletons, but only those strong enough to carry heavy weapons. These humans, however, had elevated the technology to a level that made each soldier a walking fortress. I observed everything with unsettling clarity, as if every detail were being burned into my mind. The emblems on their uniforms, the metallic sheen of their armor, the rhythmic sound of their synchronized march. And then it hit me. Throughout the entire war, we had never truly understood who we were fighting. My neighbors were also watching, their faces mirroring my astonishment. If we had known the humans' true strength, would we have hesitated before declaring war? Perhaps. But then again, we were so confident in our army's superiority that nothing likely could have stopped us. That confidence, I now realized, was our greatest flaw. Arrogance and ignorance had doomed us. We weren't defeated by treachery or luck. We had simply underestimated our enemies and overestimated ourselves. In a way, it was almost comforting to realize our downfall followed a cruel but logical pattern, like one of the old cautionary tales. As the soldiers passed in perfect formation, almost hypnotic in their precision, I lost myself in thought. If my life were to end that day, at least I could find some meaning in what had happened. And apparently, I wasn't the only one feeling this way. And then something happened. Something that changed the way I saw our occupiers. As I watched the soldiers march, a movement caught my eye. A small child, likely distracted and unaware of the gravity of the situation, ran out from the atrium of a building. She wore a white garment that fluttered in the wind as she moved directly into the path of the military column. My heart froze. I braced for the worst, for her to be crushed by the exoskeletons or at least shoved aside with brutal force. But what happened next left me speechless. One of the human soldiers, breaking formation as if by instinct, knelt and scooped her up. It was hard to believe something so massive could show such gentleness. The child didn't cry, nor did she appear scared, as the soldier lifted her and carried her back to the building's portico. To my surprise, the soldier placed the girl on a bench and pulled something small from a pouch. Though I couldn't see clearly what it was, moments later the soldier returned to formation, his armor clinking as he marched. The girl, curious but calm, watched him walk away before beginning to eat what he had given her. It was food. Shortly after, someone came out of the building to retrieve the girl, while the humans continued their march, seemingly oblivious to our astonished gazes. That simple, unexpected moment planted a seed of doubt in me. Maybe, just maybe, our worst fears wouldn't come true. Before the fleet's arrival, I had debated whether it was better to die in the first wave of violence or live to see the oppression that followed. The absence of executions during the surrender ceremony had been an unexpected sign of hope, yet I still feared the occupation would be as brutal as the reports from the colonies suggested. Now, for the first time, there was a faint glimmer of hope that the future might not be as dark as we feared. The way that human soldier treated the little girl lingered in my mind. It was disconcerting. We had always been told that humans were heartless monsters, yet that moment planted an uncomfortable doubt. Could it be that we were wrong about them? Perhaps it was worth surviving long enough to see what life under their rule would truly be like. If they were capable of acts of kindness, perhaps the horrifying stories we'd heard about the occupied colonies weren't entirely true. As the sun set on the day of surrender, the day that was supposed to mark the end of everything, a single thought kept circling in my mind. What if we had been mistaken about humans? The occupation forces took control of government buildings in Varnax and established checkpoints along major roads. The tension was palpable, and the fear of the unknown consumed us. I still had my job as far as I knew. As a humble public servant, I was instructed to report to the local administrators, assigned by the humans. The day after the surrender, I made my way to work, passing through checkpoints and armed soldiers, my heart pounding. At any moment, I expected to be detained or worse. Instead, my supervisor simply directed me to continue my usual tasks and informed me that I would be called into a meeting with the human officer in charge of our department at some point during the day. The hours that followed were the longest and most agonizing of my life. Every sound, every movement around me felt amplified. Around noon, we were instructed to gather in a conference room on the 4th floor. I climbed the stairs on shaky legs, passing several human soldiers on the way. Up close, their armor seemed less intimidating but no less imposing. Along with about 20 colleagues, I sat around an oval table, the heavy silence wrapping around us. No one dared speak. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened. A human entered, tall, composed. His gaze swept across the room with a calm that was almost unnerving. "My name is Douglas," he said with a peculiar accent. His voice was firm but not threatening. It took me a moment to realize Douglas was a proper name. It was strange, unpronounceable to many of us, yet there was something in his demeanor that conveyed sincerity. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. What would he say? What were our new orders? Were we about to be dismissed, arrested, or worse? Thousands of terrifying possibilities raced through my mind in mere seconds. "I'm here to ensure the transition is as smooth as possible," Douglas continued. "I understand this is a difficult time, but we want to work together to rebuild and move forward." Those words were not what we expected. I looked around and saw the same expression of surprise on my colleagues' faces. Could it be true? Was he being genuine? As Douglas explained the plans to maintain our jobs and collaborate on administrative reorganization, a mix of relief and confusion swept over me. The suspense didn't fade, but something had shifted. The narrative we thought we knew was crumbling, and a new reality, full of uncertainties, was beginning to unfold. But could we trust it? Or was this merely the prelude to something even darker? The end of the world didn't come with an explosion, but with the silence of an undeniable truth. Douglas continued explaining the new regulations. His presentation was meticulous, filled with charts and diagrams detailing the standardization procedures we would implement. It was strange how everything felt so routine, almost mundane, considering we were under the occupation of a force we had once seen as our mortal enemies. He spoke with an unexpected calmness, devoid of the arrogance or condescension I had imagined from an occupying commander. As he outlined the procedures for official documents, including submitting triplicates to our own authorities and human censors, the surreal nature of the situation struck me. This was the day after the end. And yet, everything continued. Over time, I got to know Douglas better. I even learned to pronounce his name correctly, though he never insisted on it. He was surprisingly fair, competent, kind, but firm when necessary. Disconcertingly, he showed more respect for me and my colleagues than many of our own Valtherian leaders ever had. The other humans under his leadership were similarly unexpected. They weren't monsters. They weren't the villains of the stories we had been told. And as time passed, I began to see something I might have always known. Deep down, the end of the war hadn't been the end of everything. It was a new beginning, but it wasn't easy. The pain of loss and humiliation remained palpable. Every devastated street, every empty chair at the dinner table was a cruel reminder of what we had lost. And admitting that we had waged an imperialist war fueled by arrogance and ignorance was a wound that was slow to heal. Yet something was emerging from the ashes, a slow but growing realization that perhaps the end of the old Valtherian Empire was an opportunity. Working with the humans, I saw they weren't the threat we had imagined, but a chance to rebuild, not to reclaim what we were, but to create something better. The humans had brought destruction, but they had also brought hope. And as I looked at Douglas, a being who had become my friend, I realized the future wasn't something to fear, but to build. We were no longer the Valtherians we once were, but that didn't mean we couldn't become something else, something greater. And so the end of the world wasn't a conclusion. It was a new beginning. The fall of an empire doesn't mean the end, but the chance to be reborn. How do you see the future? Share your thoughts in the comments and join us in reflecting on how today's decisions shape the worlds of tomorrow. Because, in the end, it's not the stars that guide us, but the choices we make in their light.